My son stood in my living room 4 days after we buried my husband and told me I was forgetting things. He had examples. He had concern in his voice. What he didn't know was that 3 floors above us, inside the building my husband spent 30 years building, there was a camera, and it had been recording for months. The coffee was too hot, but I drank it anyway. That was the thing about grief nobody warned you about, not the crying, not the silence, but the small rebellions. Drinking scalding coffee at 6 in the morning because Harold always said to let it cool first. Leaving his reading glasses on the side table because moving them felt like agreeing with something I wasn't ready to agree with yet. 4 days since we buried him. The flowers people had brought were still arranged along the entryway, white lilies mostly, a few arrangements of roses, and the whole house carried that particular sweetness that I had come to associate with things ending. I had opened the kitchen window twice already, trying to move the air through. It hadn't helped much. My name is Dorothy Callahan. Most people call me Dot. For 25 years, I sat on the civil bench in Richmond, Virginia. And in that time, I learned one thing above everything else. The room tells you what kind of case you're walking into, before anyone says a single word. The flowers that day told me something was already in motion. I just didn't have the full picture yet. I heard Ryan's car before I saw it. My son Ryan Callahan, 44 years old, Harold's only child from his first marriage, a man who had spent the better part of his adult life being charming in rooms where charm was the primary currency, pulled into the driveway at 9:30. I watched through the kitchen window as he sat in the car for a moment before getting out. That pause told me he had rehearsed what he was about to say. He came in without knocking. He had always done that. For 20 years I had never said anything about it. Mom. He set a paper bag on the counter, pastries from somewhere, a gesture of normalcy. I figured you could use some company. I looked at the bag, then at him. You drove 40 minutes to bring me a croissant? Something moved across his face. Quick, almost imperceptible. I wanted to check on you. I poured him a cup of coffee without being asked. It was the kind of thing you do automatically when someone has been coming into your kitchen for 2 decades. Old habits are honest, that way they don't know yet that things have changed. He waited until we were both seated before he opened his folder. I noticed the folder immediately. Legal-sized, the kind with the metal clasp at the top. Harold had owned 20 just like it. Ryan set it on the table with the careful casualness of someone who had practiced the gesture. I've been thinking, he said, about what comes next. Practical things. I know the timing isn't great, but some of this can't wait. What things? He cleared his throat. Dad handled a lot of the financial decisions. The building, the accounts, the maintenance schedule. You've got enough to deal with right now, without Ryan. My voice came out quieter than I intended. What's in the folder? He opened it. Inside was a typed list, 2 pages, single-spaced. He slid it across the table toward me. I looked at it without picking it up. It was a list of incidents. Dates, descriptions, brief notations. Called me twice in one evening asking the same question. Left the stove on Tuesday morning. Forgot the Hendersons' dinner party, had to be reminded 3 times. Each item was small on its own. Together, they had the shape of a case being built. This is a record, I said. It's a concern. He leaned forward slightly. You've been under enormous stress. That affects memory. That affects judgment. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed. I pushed the list back toward him. I'm wondering when you found the time to write all of this down. He didn't answer that. Instead, he reached for the second document in the folder. The building on Grace Street, he said. Dad's building. It needs active management, someone who can make decisions quickly, handle the tenants, deal with the city, if anything comes up with the zoning. He placed the second document in front of me. I've already spoken with someone who can help. A business associate. He has experience with exactly this kind of property. I looked at the document. It was a property management agreement, partially filled out. My name was on it. Harold's signature line was blank because Harold was gone. And in the section marked Managing Partner, there was a name I hadn't seen before. Victor Hale. I read it twice. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at my son across the table. Who is Victor Hale? I asked. A colleague. Very experienced. He handles several properties in the Richmond area. He's already familiar with the building. He expressed interest when Dad was still. Ryan stopped himself. Started again. He knows the market. I looked back at the name on the document. Victor Hale. Something about it sat wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Not alarm, not yet. More like the feeling you get when you walk into a courtroom and recognize a name on the docket without being able to place exactly where you've heard it before. The kind of familiarity that arrives without context. "I'll think about it," I said. Ryan nodded, satisfied enough with that for now. He stayed another 40 minutes, ate his croissant, talked about things that didn't matter. And when he left, he took the folder but forgot or chose to leave the management agreement on my kitchen table. I sat with it for a long time after his car disappeared down the street. Victor Hale. I knew that name. I just couldn't remember yet from where. And in my experience, the things you almost remember are always the things that matter most. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was in my car. Not because I had a plan, not because I knew what I was looking for, but 25 years on the bench had taught me that the answer to an uncomfortable question rarely lives in the room where the question was asked. Ryan had come to my kitchen with a rehearsed speech and a document bearing a name I almost recognized. The document was still on my table, the name was still in my head, and sitting in that house, surrounded by flowers that smelled like endings, was not going to tell me anything useful. Gray Street was 12 minutes from the house. I had driven it so many times over the years that my hands knew the turns before my mind did. Harold had purchased the building 31 years ago, a 6-story commercial property in the kind of Richmond neighborhood that had been unremarkable for decades and was only now beginning to attract the kind of attention that made land values move. He never talked about it as an investment. He talked about it the way he talked about most things. He cared about practically, without sentiment, but with the particular steadiness of someone who intended to keep it. I pulled into the small lot beside the building and sat for a moment, looking up at the facade. Brick and glass, slightly worn at the corners. A few of the window frames could have used fresh paint. Harold had always said he'd get to that. He never did. Frank Delaney was in the lobby when I walked in. Frank, 65 years old, building manager for the past 20 years, the kind of man who knew every tenant's name and every pipe and every wall, looked up from the maintenance log he was reviewing and stopped the moment he saw me. His expression did the thing people's expressions do when they're surprised and sorry at the same time and don't know which one to lead with. "Mrs. Calloway." He set the log down and came around the desk. I'm glad you came by. I've been meaning to reach out after the service. I just didn't want to intrude." "You're not intruding, Frank." I shook his hand. His grip was firm in the careful way of someone who has spent decades being reliable. "I wanted to see the building." He nodded like that made complete sense, because to him, it probably did. Harold had loved this building. Coming here was a reasonable thing for a widow to do. We walked the lobby together first, the old marble floors Harold had insisted on keeping, the brass fixtures he had polished himself on more occasions than Frank probably knew. I let the silence between us settle into something comfortable before I asked the question. "Has anyone come by recently? Anyone who wasn't a tenant?" Frank's pace slowed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. "What kind of anyone?" "Someone asking questions about the building, about its status, its value, that sort of thing." He stopped walking, turned to face me with the expression of a man deciding how much to say. I had seen that expression in courtrooms hundreds of times. I waited. "There was a gentleman," Frank said carefully. "Came by 3 times over the past 2 months. Said he was a property consultant. Asked about occupancy rates, lease terms, the structural assessment we did in March." He paused. "He seemed to know quite a bit already." "Did he give you a name?" "Left a card." Frank reached into his shirt pocket, the gesture of someone who had been carrying that card around, uncertain what to do with it. He held it out to me. I looked at it without taking it from his hand. "Victor Hale, Property Investment Advisors of Virginia." There it was. Not on a document in my kitchen. In my husband's building. 3 visits over 2 months. "Did Harold know he was coming?" I asked. Frank's jaw tightened slightly. "That's the thing, Mrs. Calloway. The first time, I told Mr. Harold about it that same afternoon. He got very quiet. A pause. He told me not to let the man back in. And then he came back 2 more times anyway, once when Mr. Harold was in a meeting upstairs, once about 3 weeks before he stopped himself, before the end." I handed the card back to Frank. He took it, looking uncertain whether he'd said too much or not enough. "You mentioned a structural assessment in March," I said. "Where are those records kept?" "Management office. 2nd floor." He hesitated. "Mrs. Calloway, is everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. "Can you show me the security footage?" The management office on the second floor had a monitor mounted to the wall above the filing cabinets, a standard setup, 4 camera feeds cycling through the lobby, the parking lot, the main corridor, and the service entrance. Frank pulled up the archived footage without asking for clarification, which told me he had already looked at it himself and knew exactly what I was about to see. He scrolled back 6 weeks. There was Victor Hale, standing in the lobby of my husband's building, speaking with the daytime receptionist who had since moved to another job. Medium height, well-dressed in the precise way of someone whose appearance is a professional tool. He was holding a leather portfolio and gesturing toward the building directory with the easy confidence of a man who was accustomed to being given access. I watched the timestamp. 6 weeks ago. Harold had still been alive 6 weeks ago, barely, but alive, in and out of the specialist's office, tired in the evenings in a way he hadn't been a year before, though he would never have said so. Frank advanced the footage. Second visit, then a third. 4 days later. "He always stayed under 20 minutes, Frank said quietly. "Talked to whoever was at the front, asked about the upper floors. Never went above the lobby." I watched Victor Hale on the screen, the way he moved through the space, the way his eyes tracked the room. Not the curiosity of someone discovering a building, the assessment of someone who had already decided what to do with it. "Frank," I said, without looking away from the monitor. "The first visit. What was the exact date?" He checked the timestamp. Told me. I did the math in my head. Victor Hale had first walked into this building 11 weeks before Harold passed away, which meant someone had told him about this property, its value, its availability, its future before Harold was gone. The question that settled into my chest, quiet and cold, was not who had told him. It was when the telling had begun. The house was quiet in a different way at night. During the day, silence had weight, the absence of Harold's voice, his footsteps, the small sounds a person makes just by existing in a space. At night, the quiet felt older, more settled, as if the house itself had accepted what I hadn't finished processing yet. I had been sitting for an hour after getting home, letting the afternoon arrange itself into something examinable. Victor Hale. 3 visits to Grace Street. 11 weeks before Harold passed. Harold telling Frank to turn him away, and Victor returning anyway. The picture had edges now. It still didn't have a center. I got up and walked down the hall to Harold's study. The room smelled like cedar and old paper, 2 things that had always meant him to me. I stood in the doorway briefly before going in. The safe sat behind the bookshelf, not hidden dramatically, just set back the way practical men keep practical things. I found the combination card where it had always lived, turned the dial, and pulled the door open. Inside, the house deed, insurance documents, our wills. And beneath everything, flat against the back wall, a plain white envelope, my name on the front. Harold's handwriting letters slightly larger than his usual script, the way his writing had changed in those final months when holding a pen required more deliberate effort. I sat in his chair and opened it. 7 pages of yellow legal paper, handwritten, dated entries going back 6 months. He had been keeping a record. The first entry was brief. VH contacted Ryan in September. Ryan mentioned it casually said a colleague had expressed interest in Grace Street. I didn't ask more questions. Should have. Written 6 months before Harold passed, before the specialist appointments had become a fixed part of our weekly calendar. The entries grew longer as months progressed. Harold had noted dates, times, the exact language Ryan used. Ryan says he's handling the business side. Ryan says Victor has connections with the Development Authority. Ryan says it would be simpler if the property moved to new management before any zoning decisions came through. Before any zoning decisions. I set the pages down and looked at the photograph Harold had hung on the wall opposite the desk, Grace Street, 30 years ago, the building looking younger than it had any right to. The middle entries shifted the temperature of everything. Harold had contacted a former colleague at the city planning office. He had learned that Grace Street sat directly on the boundary of a proposed commercial corridor expansion 2 years in the making, moving through approval channels the way projects move when the people behind them prefer things quiet. Once formalized, land values along that corridor would change in ways that made the current numbers look modest. Harold had underlined one word twice. Significantly, Victor Hale had known about the corridor before Harold did, which meant someone had given him that information. The only person with consistent access to Harold's financial affairs, the only person positioned to pass along details about Grace Street's future value, had arrived at my kitchen that morning carrying pastries and typed list of my memory failures. I pressed both hands flat against the desk and let that land completely. The final 2 pages were written differently. Slower, more deliberate, the careful pace of a man composing something meant to be found and understood rather than simply filed away. Harold laid out what he believed was being planned. Not speculation, he was not a man who dressed guesswork in the language of fact, but the pattern he had observed, the timeline he had reconstructed, and where both led when followed without flinching. Near the bottom of the second-to-last page, he had written a name and a phone number. Margaret Chen, Estate and Trust Law. She knows what to do. Go to her first before you speak to anyone else, before you sign anything, before you make any decisions about the building. She has been waiting for your call. I copied the name and number into a small notebook from the desk drawer. Then I turned to the last page. 1 paragraph. The handwriting steadier here than anywhere else in the document, as if writing the final words had settled something in him. I don't know how much time I have to handle this myself, so I handled it a different way. I built something they can never touch. Trust Margaret, trust yourself, and don't let them tell you who you are. I read it 3 times. I built something they can never touch. I didn't know yet what form it had taken, what Harold had quietly constructed during those months, when I believed he was simply managing paperwork between appointments. But I knew him. When Harold said something was handled, it was handled completely, with nothing left unfinished at the edges. I returned the pages to the envelope to the safe. Then I sat in his chair a while longer, the cedar smell around me, the photograph of Grace Street on the wall across from me. Tomorrow, I would call Margaret Chen. Tonight, I would sit with what Harold had left behind. Whatever he had built, they were never going to touch it. I called at 8 o'clock sharp. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered clear, unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has spent decades in rooms where precision matters. I gave my name. There was a brief pause, the particular pause of recognition rather than confusion. Mrs. Calloway, she said, Harold told me you would call. Come in at 9. No small talk. No condolences offered over the phone. Just the information I needed and the expectation that I would act on it. I decided I liked her before I had even seen her face. Margaret Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a building on West Broad Street, the kind of address that announced competence without announcing itself. No elaborate signage, no decorative flourishes in the lobby, just a brass plate beside the elevator. Chen Estate and Trust Law, by appointment. She was 60 years old, trim and precise in the way of someone whose relationship with time had always been professional rather than casual. Silver-streaked hair, reading glasses on the desk rather than her face, a dark jacket that suggested she had already been working for several hours before I arrived. She stood when I entered and extended her hand across the desk, one firm shake, direct eye contact, then she gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mrs. Calloway." I sat. "Harold came to see me 8 months ago," she began, without preamble. "He said he was updating his estate documents." That was true, but it wasn't the complete reason. She opened a folder on her desk, not toward me, just open, the way lawyers do when they want you to know the documentation exists, without making the meeting feel like a transaction. He told me he had concerns about the building on Grace Street, specifically about what might happen to it if he were no longer in a position to protect it himself. He was already ill, I said. He had received an initial prognosis, yes. He didn't share the details with me. That wasn't what he came for. What he came for was to make sure something was in place before the situation developed further. She looked at me steadily. He was a thorough man. He was, I said. Margaret reached for a document from the folder and placed it on the desk between us. Not a draft, not a working copy, a finalized, notarized instrument dated 8 months ago to the week. "Harold transferred the building on Grace Street into an irrevocable trust," she said. "He is named as the original grantor. You are named as the sole beneficiary. The trust became fully active upon his passing." She let that settle for a moment. "What that means, practically, is this. The building no longer exists as part of the general estate. It is not subject to probate. It cannot be contested through the standard channels available to family members or creditors. Any legal challenge to your ownership would have to demonstrate that Harold lacked capacity at the time of signing, and I have 3 independent evaluations confirming he was entirely competent. I looked at the document, Harold's signature at the bottom, familiar and steady, from 8 months ago, before the worst of it, when he still had time to do this right. Ryan doesn't know, I said. Harold specifically instructed me not to disclose the trust's existence to anyone until you came to see me, which is why I've been waiting. She folded her hands on the desk. Whatever your son and his associate have been planning, and Harold gave me enough context to understand the general shape of it, they have been planning to take something that is no longer available to be taken. The clarity of that sentence was almost physical. Victor Hale, the 3 visits, the management agreement on my kitchen table, the list of my supposed memory failures. 8 months of preparation aimed at a target that Harold had quietly moved out of reach before any of it began. He never told me, I said. Not accusation, just fact. The same way you state a fact in a courtroom when the fact speaks for itself. He said you would have insisted on being involved, Margaret replied, and that your involvement would have made it visible. He wanted it invisible until it was needed. That was Harold, completely. Margaret closed the folder and set it to one side. There is one more thing, she said. Her tone shifted slightly, not uncertain, but careful. The way someone speaks when they're conveying information they don't entirely possess. Harold built an additional layer into the trust structure, a specific activation mechanism that goes beyond the standard legal protections. She paused. He didn't explain it to me. He said the details were yours. I looked at her. He said you would know what it was when you needed to, she continued. I don't have the specifics that was deliberate on his part. Whatever this layer is, it exists outside my documentation. She met my eyes directly. He was quite certain you would recognize it. The room was quiet for a moment. I didn't know what Harold meant, not yet. But I had learned over 31 years with that man that when he said something was already handled, the only question worth asking was not whether it was true, but where he had put it. Thank you, I said, standing. Margaret stood as well. Whatever you need going forward, I'm here. She said it the way Harold had probably said it to her, as a statement of fact, not reassurance. I picked up my bag and walked to the door. Behind me, on her desk, sat the document Harold had signed 8 months ago. The building on Grace Street was mine, completely, irrevocably. And somewhere, in a place Harold had trusted only me to find, there was one more door he had left open, and only I held the key. The coffee was still brewing when the phone rang. It was 7:20 on a Wednesday morning, and I had spent the previous 5 days doing what Harold would have called necessary homework, reviewing every document Margaret had given me, calling the building twice to check on Frank, and sitting in Harold's chair long enough each night to remember why the fight was worth having. I did not recognize the number. It was a Richmond area code, but not one I knew. My first instinct, honed from 30 years on the bench, was to let it go to voicemail. My second instinct, the one that had been running louder lately, told me to answer. Is this Dorothy Callahan? The voice was careful, not nervous exactly, but measured in the way people speak when they have been rehearsing. It is, I said. Who is this? My name is Patricia Moon. I don't expect you to know me. A brief pause, but I knew Harold. I set down my mug. Patricia Moon, I would come to learn, was 64 years old, a former administrative coordinator at the Richmond Development Authority, the same city office that had quietly approved the commercial corridor expansion Harold had written about in his notes. She had worked there for 19 years before retiring 14 months ago. She had known Harold in a professional capacity for most of that time, not as a close friend, but as what she called a man you remember because he always did what he said he would. He came to see me, she said, about 8 months ago. Before the illness had really taken hold, he asked me about a man named Victor Hale. I did not say anything. I had learned, in courtrooms and kitchens alike, that silence is sometimes the most useful tool a person has. Harold had seen Victor at the authority offices 3 times, in the span of about 4 months, Patricia continued. Not in any official meeting, more like someone who knew which hallways to walk down, which doors to knock on quietly. She paused. Harold asked me if I recognized him. I did. Victor Hale, according to Patricia, had made informal contact with 2 members of the Corridor Planning Committee, not through official channels, but through the kind of conversations that happen at the edges of meetings, in parking decks and restaurant booths, He had positioned himself as a private investment advisor with an interest in properties along the proposed expansion route. He had asked, in the language of someone who already knew the answer, which parcels were most likely to increase in value once the corridor was approved. Harold wasn't sure what Victor intended, Patricia said, but he was sure Victor was moving early. Before any announcement, before prices adjusted, her voice dropped slightly. Harold asked me one specific question. He wanted to know if Victor had ever mentioned the Grace Street building by name. Hatte? Once, she said. To one of the committee members, he called it the anchor parcel, said whoever controlled it would be in the best position once development moved through. The anchor parcel, Harold's building, 31 years of careful ownership, reduced to a strategic calculation in someone else's plan. Harold thanked me, Patricia continued. He told me he was going to handle it. He didn't tell me how, but he said, and I've thought about this many times since he said, Patricia, if anything happens to me before I finish, someone will come asking. Help them the way you helped me. I had to sit down. Why are you calling now? I asked. Harold passed over 2 weeks ago. Because it took me this long to be sure. Her voice was quieter now. And because last week, I saw Victor Hale's car parked outside my building 2 mornings in a row. The line went quiet for a moment. Mrs. Calloway, Mrs. Callahan, I want to send you something. Harold gave me a document. A single page. He said to hold it until someone came asking. But after seeing that car, I don't think I should wait any longer. She exhaled. I think you need to see what Victor said to that committee member. Directly. In writing. Patricia. The sound came through the phone before she could finish a knock. Firm and deliberate. Somewhere on her end of the line. Her voice changed immediately. Not panicked, but stripped of everything except urgency. Someone's outside. And the line went dead. I tried Patricia's number 4 times before noon. Each call went to voicemail, the kind with no recorded greeting, just a long mechanical tone and then silence. I left a message on the 3rd attempt, kept it brief, and asked her to call me back when she was able. After the 4th, I set the phone face down on the counter and stood at the kitchen window for a long moment. Patricia had known something was wrong before she hung up. She had been careful, deliberate, the kind of person who measured her words before spending them. That made her sudden silence harder to dismiss than panic from a stranger would have been. But I had lived long enough to know that waiting without direction is just worry wearing a useful disguise. I called Arthur Webb at 11:30. Arthur Webb was 78 years old, a retired circuit court judge who had served Richmond for 22 years before stepping down a decade ago. He and Harold had known each other since law school, the kind of friendship that does not require frequent contact to remain solid, like a well-built wall that holds even when no one is looking at it. After Harold's diagnosis, Arthur had come by the house twice, sat in the living room, and said very little, which was exactly the right thing to do. He answered on the 2nd ring. Dorothy, he said. In the way people say a name when they already know the call is not casual. I need to ask you about someone, I said. Victor Hale. A pause. Not surprise, more like the sound of a man deciding how much to say and in what order. Where are you? He asked. Home. Come here instead. Some conversations don't belong on phones. Arthur lived in a colonial house in the museum district, the kind of property that had been in a family long enough that the neighborhood had changed 3 times around it while the house stayed exactly the same. His housekeeper showed me into the back sitting room, where Arthur was already standing near the window, which I recognized as an old habit of his. He had always preferred to see a room's light before he decided where to sit. He poured 2 glasses of water and did not offer anything else. Victor Hale, he said, settling into the armchair across from me. Harold mentioned that name to me, about 7 months ago. What did he tell you? He said he had seen someone at the Development Authority offices, someone who did not belong there in any official capacity, and that the man had been asking questions about properties along the proposed corridor route. Arthur set his glass down. Harold had done some asking of his own. What he found was not encouraging. Arthur had confirmed what Harold found through a colleague in Charlottesville, a retired attorney named Grayson, who had followed a case 2 years earlier involving a woman named Eleanor Sims. Eleanor Sims was 73 at the time, a widow who had owned a mixed-use commercial building on the west side of Charlottesville for nearly 20 years. Her husband had left it to her. She had managed it herself, quietly and competently, for most of that time. After her husband passed, a man introduced himself as a property investment advisor, a specialist in helping widowed property owners manage assets during times of transition. His name was Victor Hale. Over the following 10 months, Arthur said, Eleanor signed a series of documents she was told were standard management agreements, quarterly fee arrangements, refinancing structures to improve cash flow. His voice was measured, the way it had always been in courtrooms, not cold, but precise. By the time she realized what she had signed, $180,000 had moved out of accounts she believed were still fully in her name. I kept my hands still in my lap. Was he charged? He was investigated. A financial examiner looked at the documentation for several months. Arthur looked at the window briefly. Every signature was hers. Every authorization had her name on it. The position taken was that the documents, while aggressive in their terms, had been signed knowingly. He paused. The inquiry was closed without charges being filed. The room was quiet for a moment. I thought about Eleanor, a woman who had managed a building alone for 20 years, who had been careful enough to hold on to it, and who had still been maneuvered into a position where her own signature had been used as the argument against her. What happened to her afterward? I asked. She lost the building, Arthur said, and most of what had been in those accounts. But she did not lose everything. He looked at me directly for the first time since I had sat down. Eleanor fought back. She found a lawyer named Dennis Farrow. She didn't win everything, but she didn't lose everything either. He let that sentence sit in the room without adding to it. Dennis Farrow. I did not know the name, but the way Arthur had said it, with the particular care of a man who respected a professional he had watched operate from a distance, told me that the name mattered. I drove home with the windows down, letting the afternoon air move through the car, thinking about a woman I had never met who had faced the same pattern from the same man and had still found a way to hold her ground. I needed to find Eleanor Sims, and I needed to understand what Dennis Farrow had managed to do for her. Sunrise Manor sat at the edge of a quiet road outside Charlottesville, a low, well-kept building surrounded by old oak trees that looked like they had been there longer than the structure itself. The parking area was nearly empty at 8:30 in the morning, and the front desk staff directed me to a common room at the end of the east wing without asking many questions. I had called ahead. Eleanor had agreed to see me. She was already sitting when I arrived. Eleanor Sims was 75 years old, with white hair cut practically short and hands folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned not to show discomfort to strangers. She was small in the chair, but not frail, the kind of small that comes from a person who has simply stopped taking up more space than they need. She looked at me the way people look when they already know what the visit is about and have decided to say everything. "You're the judge," she said. "Retired," I said. "Sit down then. I've been waiting for someone to come." She had been at Sunrise Manor for 14 months. Before that, she had lived in a house on Maple Ridge that she and her husband had owned for 31 years. That house was no longer hers. Eleanor began at the beginning, which I had learned was usually the best place to start. Her husband, Gerald, had passed away 3 years ago after a long illness. Eleanor had managed their commercial building on the west side of Charlottesville throughout his sickness and continued afterward. She was not an expert in finance, she told me plainly, but she was not careless either. She paid attention, she asked questions, she read what she signed, or so she believed. Victor Hale had first contacted her through a referral that turned out to be fabricated, a name she recognized from Gerald's old professional circle, vouching for a specialist in widowed estate management. It was her son Thomas who had passed the contact along. Thomas thought he was helping, Eleanor said. There was no anger in her voice when she said it. That absence was more telling than bitterness would have been. He had met Victor at some kind of investment gathering. Victor was persuasive. Thomas believed him. Over the following 10 months, Eleanor signed a series of documents management agreements, cash flow restructuring authorizations, quarterly advisory retainers. Each time, Victor explained the documents in language that sounded technical and careful. Each time, he told her it was standard practice. "The first time I noticed something was wrong," she said. "It was a bank statement, a number that didn't match what I was expecting." She paused. Victor had an explanation for that, too. I accepted it. I was tired, and I trusted the paperwork. By the time a property attorney Eleanor hired for an unrelated matter flagged the irregularities, $180,000 had moved out of accounts in her name. The commercial building had been transferred under a management control clause that Eleanor had not understood she was signing. The clause gave Victor effective operational authority under the terms of a refinancing agreement. The investigation that followed lasted several months. Every document was reviewed. Every signature was authenticated. They told me the signatures were valid, Eleanor said quietly. And they were. Every one of them was mine. I just didn't understand what I was signing. The inquiry ended without charges. The building did not come back. I lost the building, she said, and most of what was in those accounts. I sold the house later to pay for this. She looked around the common room briefly, without self-pity. Thomas has never forgiven himself. I've told him it wasn't his fault. I'm not sure he believes me yet. She had found Dennis Farrow through a legal aid referral 18 months after the inquiry closed. By then, Eleanor had almost nothing left to recover. But Farrow had reviewed the original documents and identified a specific clause, an obscure provision buried in the refinancing agreement that had not been properly disclosed at the time of signing. It wasn't enough to reclaim the building or the full amount, but it was enough to recover a partial settlement that paid for 3 years at Sunrise Manor and left Eleanor with a small stable reserve. He was thorough, she said, and honest. He told me exactly what he could do and what he couldn't. She looked at me steadily. He's still practicing, as far as I know. Richmond area, I believe now. I held that information carefully. Farrow was in Richmond. Ryan was in Richmond. A lawyer that thorough, that familiar with the specific mechanisms Victor used, and he was currently working in the same city where Victor was now running the same pattern again. Did Farrow ever mention other cases? I asked. Other clients with similar situations? Eleanor studied me for a moment. He mentioned there had been others, she said. He didn't give me names, but he said the pattern was recognizable. She paused. He said the men who do this choose carefully. They look for someone with something worth taking and someone nearby who can be convinced to open the door. I thanked her. She nodded once, folded her hands again, and looked toward the window. The lawyer who handled my case, Farrow, she said as I stood. He's still practicing. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The porch light came on automatically when I reached the front door, and in that moment I saw him standing to the left of the steps. Ryan, hands at his sides, no briefcase, no folder, nothing in his arms except the particular posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say on the drive over. He had not called ahead. "Mom," he said. The word landed the way it always does when someone uses it as both greeting and argument. I unlocked the door without rushing and held it open. He came in, stood in the entryway, and looked at the house the way people look at places they grew up in when they are not sure if they are welcome, scanning without meaning to, checking whether anything had changed. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "I have." He nodded and followed me to the living room. I sat in the armchair by the window. He took the sofa, perched at the near end of it, elbows on his knees, the posture of a man trying to seem casual while being the opposite. I waited. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "About how much you're handling right now. The building, the estate paperwork, everything Dad left, it's a lot for one person. I've managed before. I know you have." He said it quickly, as if agreeing would help him move past the point faster. "That's not what I mean. I think it would help to have people around you. People who understand this kind of thing." "What kind of thing?" He shifted slightly. "Property management, asset planning, the decisions that need to be made about the building going forward." He paused. "I've been talking to Victor about it. He has a lot of experience with exactly this kind of transition." I kept my expression neutral. 30 years on the bench teaches you that the most useful thing a face can do in certain moments is nothing at all. "Victor," I repeated. "He's good at what he does, Mom. He's helped other families in situations like ours." Ryan leaned forward slightly. "I think if you just sat down with him not to sign anything, just to listen, you'd feel better about the whole thing. Less alone with it." He believed what he was saying. That much was clear. Or he had believed it long enough that the belief had become comfortable, the way a wrong answer becomes familiar when you have repeated it often enough. But there was something else in his face that evening that I had not seen before, or perhaps had not been looking for. It was around the eyes, a tightness that had nothing to do with concern for me. It was the particular expression of someone who is working against a deadline they cannot mention. I had seen it in courtrooms. It was the face of a person waiting for something they were not in control of. A family meeting, I said. That's what you're proposing. Just a conversation. You, me, Victor. Somewhere comfortable. No pressure. No pressure. The phrase carried exactly as much weight as he intended it to, and also exactly as much as he did not. When? I asked. Soon. He said the word carefully, and then, before he could redirect it, something else came through the thing he had been trying not to lead with. Victor says things need to move quickly. With the estate still in process, there are timing considerations. Windows that close. He stopped himself. Not because he had said too much, exactly, but because he heard something in his own voice that surprised him. A small recalibration passed across his face. I just mean, he said more slowly, that it's better to have support in place sooner rather than later. I nodded once. I'll think about it. Ryan stayed another 20 minutes. He talked about smaller things, a restaurant he had been to, a neighbor's renovation project, a question about Harold's old reading chair. Normal conversation layered over the real reason he had come, the way a coat covers whatever is underneath it without changing its shape. When he left, I walked him to the door and watched his car pull away from the curb. Then I went back inside, sat down in Harold's chair, and thought about the word quickly. Not quickly as in soon, quickly as in before something becomes impossible, quickly as in before a window that Victor had identified closed on its own terms, or before someone else opened a different door entirely. Ryan had not said any of that. He had said only what he meant to say, but I had spent 3 decades listening to what people almost said, and the distance between Victor's urgency and Ryan's careful phrasing was not as large as Ryan believed it to be. There were things in motion I did not fully understand yet, and someone was trying to make sure I never did. I called Daniel Reeves at 7 in the morning. Daniel was 51 years old, a building systems contractor who had worked with Harold for nearly 15 years, handling everything from electrical upgrades to security installations at the Grace Street property. He was not a close friend of the family, but he was the kind of professional Harold trusted implicitly, which in Harold's vocabulary meant more than friendship. When Harold trusted someone with the building, he trusted them with something that mattered. Daniel picked up on the second ring and did not ask many questions. He said he could meet me at the building at 8:30. He was there at 8:15. Frank Delaney was already inside when we arrived, opening the lobby the way he had for 20 years, keys on a ring, coffee in a paper cup, the same unhurried routine regardless of what was happening around him. He nodded at Daniel with recognition and looked at me briefly before stepping back to give us room. Harold asked me to check the system about 6 months ago, Daniel said as we walked toward the utility corridor behind the main staircase. Said he wanted to make sure the coverage was solid. We upgraded 2 of the existing units and added a 3rd in the east corridor. He paused at a gray metal door and used a key from his own ring to open it. What he didn't tell me at the time was that he'd also set up a secondary archive. The room behind the door was small, a maintenance space with exposed conduit and a gray metal shelf unit along the far wall. On the middle shelf sat a compact network recorder, no larger than a hardcover book, connected by a single cable to a port in the wall. He routed it to a private cloud account, Daniel said, crouching to examine the back of the unit. Separate from the building's main system, different login, different server. Nobody would find it unless they knew it was here. Harold had built a secondary archive that no one else knew about. I stood in that small room and felt the particular kind of recognition that comes when a person you thought you understood reveals another layer, not a surprise exactly, but a confirmation of something you had always sensed without being able to name. Daniel connected his laptop to the recorder and accessed the cloud account using credentials Harold had stored in the building's maintenance file, a detail Daniel had found unremarkable at the time and now understood differently. The archive contained 4 months of continuous footage from all 3 cameras, the lobby entrance, the east corridor near the main office suite, and a 3rd angle covering the stairwell landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors. How far back does it go? I asked. First recording is from about 4.5 months ago, Daniel said. Runs right up to last week. 4.5 months ago, Harold had been alive. He had been sick, but he had been here still coming to the building on certain mornings, still keeping his own schedule, and he had been watching. Daniel searched the footage by motion trigger and pulled the first flagged sequence from 11 weeks before Harold passed. The timestamp read a Tuesday morning, just after 10 o'clock. The east corridor camera showed 2 men walking toward the main office suite. The angle was from above and slightly behind, but the images were clear enough. One of the men was Ryan. The other, in a gray jacket and carrying a leather portfolio, moved with the particular ease of someone who had been in the building before, not looking around, not checking doors, walking as if the layout was already familiar. Victor Hale. They were in the office suite for 34 minutes. When they came out, Ryan was carrying a folder he had not brought in. Victor was speaking, and Ryan was nodding in the way people nod when they are agreeing to something they are not entirely comfortable with but have already decided to accept. Harold had been in the building that morning. His parking spot was visible in the lobby camera feed. He had been there, somewhere above those corridors, watching the same man I was watching now on a screen that was 11 weeks out of date. Daniel pulled 2 more flagged sequences, a second meeting 3 weeks later, a third 5 weeks after that. The pattern was consistent. Ryan, Victor, the same office suite. Each time, something carried in or out. Each time, the ease of men conducting business they considered settled. Then Daniel paused on the third clip. "There's someone else," he said. He rewound by 40 seconds. In the stairwell camera, the third angle, covering the landing between floors, a figure appeared briefly at the edge of the frame. Not Ryan, not Victor. A third person, standing on the landing, not moving, as if waiting to be called in or waiting for the other two to leave. The angle caught only a partial profile. Enough to establish a person, not enough to identify one. Daniel zoomed in slowly. The image held its resolution to a point and then softened. "Harold's system was good," Daniel said quietly, "but not quite good enough for this angle." I leaned closer to the screen. Whoever this person was, they had been present at least one of these meetings without appearing on any of the corridor footage. They had used the stairwell. They had known where the main cameras were, and they had stayed just far enough from the east corridor angle to avoid a clear frame. That was not an accident. "Can you pull the other clips?" I asked. "Check if this person appears in any of the others." Daniel worked through the archive for the next 20 minutes. The figure appeared in the background of 2 additional sequences, always on the stairwell landing, always at the edge of visibility. 3 meetings, 3 appearances by someone who knew the building well enough to stay out of the clearest sightlines. Not Ryan, not Victor. Someone else entirely. Daniel called at 7:45 the next morning. He had gone back into the archive the previous evening on his own time, without being asked, and pulled still frames from the 3 stairwell sequences. He had run them through an image sharpening process he used for insurance documentation work, the kind of incremental clarification that does not manufacture detail but recovers what was always there, blurred by angle and compression. "I'm sending you 3 images," he said. "Tell me if you recognize him." The photographs arrived on my phone within a minute. I opened the first one. The figure on the stairwell landing was a man in his mid-50s, lean, wearing a dark jacket and carrying nothing in his hands. The partial profile was now clear enough to read. A sharp jaw, close-cut hair going to gray at the temples, the posture of someone accustomed to standing in corridors, waiting for the right moment to enter a room. I had never seen him in person, but I had heard his name 3 times in the past 4 days. I called Margaret Chen before 8 o'clock. She arrived at the Gray Street building 40 minutes later, which told me she had already been at her office when I called the kind of attorney who arrives before her assistant and leaves after the building empties. She was carrying her briefcase and a coffee she had not touched, and she looked at the footage on Daniel's laptop with the focused attention of someone converting what they see directly into legal weight. She watched the 3 corridor sequences in full. Then she asked Daniel to replay the stairwell clips twice more. When she was done, she set her coffee down and was quiet for a moment. "I know who this is," she said. "Dennis Farrow," I said. She looked at me. "You already knew." I knew the name. I didn't know he was in this building. Margaret was quiet again for a beat. Then she straightened. "Dennis Farrow practices estate litigation and asset management law in Richmond. He has a reputation for knowing how to structure transactions that are difficult to challenge after the fact." She chose her words with the precision of someone who had written briefs for 3 decades. He represented a client in a Charlottesville matter 2 years ago, a case involving similar asset transfers. He lost, partially. "He represented Eleanor Sims," I said. Margaret looked at me with an expression that recalibrated slightly. "He was her attorney, yes. But the partial recovery his client received came because the opposing party, the man who had engineered the transfers, agreed to a settlement. Farrow did not win that case outright. He managed its resolution. I let that sit for a moment. Dennis Farrow had represented Eleanor Sims. He had watched Victor work from the inside of that case. And now, less than 2 years later, he was standing on the stairwell landing of Harold's building while Ryan and Victor met in the office suite 1 floor below. He had not come to fight Victor this time. He had come to work with him. Is the footage enough? I asked. For a guardianship challenge? Yes. Margaret's voice was steady. 3 documented meetings between your son and a known property investment advisor conducted inside your late husband's building without your knowledge, while your husband was still alive. Combined with the management agreement Ryan presented you within 4 days of Harold's passing, this establishes a pattern of preparation that a court would take seriously. She paused. I can use this. Then use it. She nodded once and opened her briefcase to retrieve a legal pad. I'll need Daniel's documentation of the archive setup, the installation records, the cloud account credentials, and the chain of custody for these images. I want everything clean before we file anything. Daniel confirmed he had all of it. Margaret wrote for several minutes without speaking. Then she stopped. There's something else, she said. She set down her pen and looked at me directly. I ran a court records search this morning. Standard procedure before a meeting like this. A brief pause. Victor Hale filed for an emergency competency hearing 6 days ago. I don't know when you were planning to be served, but the court date is set. How long? 10 days from the filing date. She glanced at her notes, which means you have approximately 10 days remaining. The room held that number for a moment. Victor had not waited for the family meeting Ryan was proposing. He had already moved through official channels while Ryan was sitting on my sofa talking about no pressure and things taking time. The filing and the visit were not 2 parts of the same strategy. They were 2 separate tracks running in parallel. He moved early, Margaret said, and the observation carried something beneath it, not surprise, but the particular quality of a professional recognizing a pattern that implies something specific. He moved early. He knows something. Spooked him. She looked at her legal pad rather than at me when she said the next part. Someone told him the situation had changed. Someone with access to enough information to know that waiting was no longer safe. She looked up. The question is who that was. Daniel was quiet near the laptop. I was quiet by the window. Somewhere between my visit to Eleanor on day 12 and this morning, Victor Hale had filed paperwork that could not have been prepared overnight. The timeline did not allow for panic. It allowed only for preparation that had begun before something changed. Something had changed, and someone had told him. Daniel found her on the 2nd day of looking. He had tracked the motel through a combination of methods he did not fully explain to me, and I did not ask him to. There are moments when the process matters less than the result, and this was one of them. What he told me was that Patricia Moon was registered under a different name at a roadside motel off Route 29, about 40 minutes south of Richmond, and that she had been there since the morning after our phone call ended. He offered to come with me. I told him I would go alone. The motel was the kind of place that had been built for function and had never been updated beyond its single-story, exterior corridor, a row of identical doors facing a parking lot that needed resurfacing. I found the room number Daniel had given me and knocked twice. Patricia Moon opened the door on the 3rd knock. She was 64 years old, as I had known from what little I had been able to learn about her before this morning, but the woman standing in the doorway looked as though the past several days had added years she had not budgeted for. She was medium height, with dark hair going to gray, and the careful, watchful quality I had recognized in her voice on the phone, that particular discipline of someone who had spent a long career in rooms where information was currency was still present, but compressed now into something smaller and more guarded. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. "You came alone," she said. "I came alone." She stepped back and let me in. The room was orderly in the way rooms become when someone has been in them long enough to impose a system, her bag by the wall, documents stacked on the small table near the window, a laptop closed beside them. She had not simply been hiding. She had been working. "I'm sorry about the call," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed while I took the chair by the table. "Someone knocked on my door that morning, and I wasn't sure who it was. I left the motel within the hour. Was it Victor? I don't know." She folded her hands. "I didn't see anyone when I looked through the window, but I wasn't willing to wait and find out." She paused. Harold warned me, before he passed, that if I ever felt uncertain about my safety, I should not try to reason my way into staying put. Harold had warned her. He had given her instructions the same way he had given me the envelope, and Margaret the trust documentation, and Daniel the archive credentials. He had prepared each piece separately and placed it with the person best suited to hold it. "He gave you something," I said. Patricia reached under the stack of documents on the table and produced a small drive compact, labeled only with a strip of tape on which Harold had written 2 letters in his deliberate hand. She held it but did not pass it to me yet. "He gave me this about 5 months before he passed," she said. "He told me what was on it. He told me not to look at it myself, not because he didn't trust me, but because he said the less I knew in detail, the safer I would be." She looked at the drive. "He said to give it only to you, and only when you had enough context to understand what you were looking at. Tell me what he told you." Patricia set the drive on the table between us. "The Eleanor Sims case," she said. "You know it was closed without charges." "I know. The official reason was that the documentation supported the transactions. Every signature authenticated, every form filed correctly." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it, not anger, exactly, but the particular flatness of someone describing a wrong they had been unable to correct. That was the stated reason. Harold believed there was another reason. She paused. There was a judge assigned to oversee the competency review portion of Eleanor's case, the evaluation of whether the transactions had been entered into knowingly. That judge made a series of procedural rulings that effectively narrowed the scope of what the financial examiner was permitted to review. Patricia looked at me steadily. Harold spent several months documenting the connection between those rulings and Victor Hale. What he found, what is on that drive, is evidence that money moved from a set of accounts Victor controlled into a private account belonging to that judge. The timing corresponds directly to the key rulings. The room was very quiet. "He influenced the outcome," I said. Harold believed so. "And the documentation on that drive is not circumstantial." She looked at the small device on the table. "It is specific. Amounts, dates, account routing information, and copies of the rulings that followed each transfer." A pause. "Harold called it the reason the case closed the way it did." I picked up the drive. It was lighter than it had any right to be, given what Patricia had just described. "The judge," I said. "Is he still on the bench?" Patricia was quiet for just a moment before she answered. "He is," she said. "He was appointed to a federal district position 14 months ago. He is currently sitting." Margaret called at 4:30 in the afternoon. She said the documentation from the drive had been reviewed by a contact she trusted, a former colleague now working in federal oversight, and that the material was being processed through proper channels. She used the word process the way attorneys use words when they mean something specific but cannot yet say what. Then she told me to go home. "There's nothing you can do tonight," she said. "Or tomorrow. Give it 48 hours. I had spent 17 days moving, gathering, driving, listening, reading, calling. The instruction to stop felt almost physical, like being asked to step off a moving platform. I sat in the car outside Margaret's office for several minutes after hanging up, watching the afternoon light change on the building across the street, before I accepted that she was right. There was nothing left to do but wait. And waiting, I had learned over the course of a long career, is not the same as doing nothing. It is simply doing something that does not look like action from the outside. I drove home in the early evening and did not turn on many lights. The house had settled into a particular kind of quiet over the past 2.5 weeks, not the acute silence of the first days after Harold passed, when every room felt like an interruption of something ongoing, but a slower, quiet, the kind that comes when a person has been present in it long enough that the absence becomes textured rather than sharp. I had grown to recognize the difference between rooms I avoided and rooms I returned to. Harold's study was the one I returned to. I sat in his chair for a while without doing anything specific, looking at the shelves the way you look at things that have been familiar for so long they become invisible until you decide to actually see them. Then I pulled the first album from the lower shelf, a large cloth-bound book Harold had assembled sometime in the late 1980s, before photographs became something you stored rather than something you held. I had not opened it in years. The early pages were from before we married Harold in his 30s, lean and serious in the way young attorneys are serious before the work teaches them when seriousness is optional. There were photographs from law school gatherings, from his first year clerking, from the apartment on Monument Avenue where he had lived before we bought the house. In several of them he was laughing, which was something the photographs reminded me of more reliably than memory did. Memory kept the important things. Photographs kept the ordinary ones. I turned pages slowly. The album gave way to a shoebox I had not opened in considerably longer letters from the first years of our marriage, written during a 4-month period when Harold had been traveling for a case, and we had not yet learned to conduct a relationship by telephone the way later generations do by instinct. The letters were folded into thirds, the envelopes addressed in Harold's earlier handwriting, which was looser then, less deliberate, still becoming what it would eventually be. I read several of them without looking for anything specific. In one, he described a particularly difficult day in deposition, a witness who had been evasive in the particular way that makes the truth harder to reach than a direct refusal would, and ended with a line I remembered receiving and had not thought about since. The room always belongs to the one who knows the most, but the court belongs to the one who is most prepared. I keep reminding myself of that. I set the letter down and sat with that for a moment. Then I found the box of anniversary cards, a habit we had kept throughout the marriage, cards given privately, separate from whatever else the occasion involved. Harold wrote in cards the way he wrote in everything, precisely, without waste, each word chosen. I started with the earliest ones. The first anniversary card was smaller than I remembered, a simple cream-colored envelope with my name on the front in Harold's handwriting from that period, still developing. Inside, the printed message was unremarkable. Harold had crossed it out, as he always did, and written his own. He had written about the year, about what he had learned, about the particular quality of building something with another person, how it was different from building anything alone, because the structure had to accommodate two people's understanding of what it was for. And at the end, in smaller letters than the rest, as if it were a postscript rather than a conclusion, "You have always known the right questions. You have always known how to make a room listen. Whatever comes the court is yours, counselor." I read the line twice. Then I sat very still in Harold's chair, in Harold's study, holding a card that was 40 years old, and understood that he had not invented the phrase for a trust document. He had been saying it to me for 40 years. He had taken the truest thing he knew about me, the thing he had recognized before. I had fully recognized it myself, and he had built it into the architecture of the most important document he ever wrote. The court is yours, counselor. Not a password, not a code, a reminder. I arrived at Margaret's office at 8 in the morning carrying everything. The USB drive Patricia had given me, Daniel's printed documentation of the cloud archive installation records, chain of custody, still frames with timestamps, the footage log Margaret had already reviewed, Harold's notes from the safe, copied and organized. The management agreement Ryan had placed on my kitchen table on day 4, which I had never signed and had kept in a folder since the morning I first looked at it carefully enough to understand what it was asking. Margaret was waiting at the door. She took the materials without ceremony, set them on the conference table in the order I had organized them, and sat down across from me. She had already made calls, she said. The contact she had mentioned, the former colleague in federal oversight, had reviewed the preliminary information from the USB and confirmed that the documentation met the threshold for federal referral. A meeting had been arranged. "This morning?" I asked. "In an hour," she said. She said it the way people say things when they have been working through the night and prefer not to draw attention to it. The FBI's Richmond field office occupied a floor of a federal building on East Main Street that announced its purpose through architecture alone, the particular combination of glass, concrete, and unhurried institutional permanence that communicates authority without needing to state it. Margaret and I arrived 12 minutes early and were escorted to a conference room on the 4th floor by a staff member who offered water and then left us with it. Agent Sarah Doyle arrived exactly on time. She was 43 years old, with the kind of focused stillness that comes not from a reserved personality, but from a professional discipline applied over a long career. She wore a dark jacket, carried a legal pad and a thin folder, and introduced herself with a handshake that was brief and direct. She identified herself as a senior agent in the Financial Crimes Division of the Richmond Field Office, with a joint assignment to a multi-district task force. She did not explain what the task force covered. She did not need to. She sat, opened her folder, and looked at the materials Margaret had arranged on the table. "I've reviewed what your attorney forwarded," she said. I'd like to go through the original documentation now, if you're ready. We went through it in sequence. Margaret presented each item with the precision of an attorney who had organized a case file for a courtroom not for effect, but for clarity. The building archive footage first. 3 documented meetings between Ryan Callahan and Victor Hale inside a private commercial property, conducted without the owner's knowledge, spanning 4 months prior to Harold's death. Then the stairwell still frames identifying Dennis Farrow as a third party present during at least 2 of those meetings. Then the management agreement, unmarked and unsigned, with the specific clauses highlighted that would have transferred operational control of the Grace Street building. Agent Doyle took notes but did not interrupt. Margaret then presented the USB. She did not simply hand it over. She described its provenance first, Harold Callahan's deliberate preparation of the documentation over several months, his decision to place it with Patricia Moon for secure keeping, the specific instructions he had left regarding its transfer. Then she summarized the contents. Financial transfer records connecting accounts under Victor Hale's control to a private account belonging to a sitting federal judge, with dates corresponding to key procedural rulings in a prior civil case in Charlottesville involving a woman named Eleanor Sims. The room was quiet while Margaret spoke. Agent Doyle's pen had stopped moving. When Margaret finished, Doyle set down her legal pad and looked at the USB on the table for a moment before picking it up. She turned it over once in her hand with the attention of someone who understood that small objects sometimes contain large consequences. "The judge identified in this documentation," she said. "You're aware he currently holds a federal appointment." "We are," Margaret said. "And the prior civil case, the Charlottesville matter, the outcome of which you believe was influenced by these transfers." "The documentation connects the transfers to specific rulings," Margaret said. "Harold Callahan spent several months building that connection." Agent Doyle set the drive down and was quiet for a moment. It was not the silence of someone uncertain about what to say. It was the silence of someone deciding how much to say and in what order. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, looking at me directly for the first time since the meeting had begun, "I want to tell you something, and I want to be clear that this is not information I would share in most circumstances." She paused. "We've been building a file on Victor Hale for 2 years. You just gave us what we needed." The sentence landed in the room with the particular weight of a thing that has been true for a long time finally being said aloud. 2 years. While Victor had been moving from Charlottesville to Richmond, from Eleanor to Harold's building, from preliminary contacts to filed paperwork, there had been a parallel record being assembled in a federal office on East Main Street that he did not know existed. Harold had not known about Doyle's file, but what Harold had built and what Doyle had been building had been moving toward the same point from different directions. And this morning, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building that communicated authority through its architecture, they had met. Margaret had cleared her morning calendar. I knew this because when I arrived at her office at 9 o'clock, the reception area was quieter than it had been on my previous visits. No other clients waiting, no files stacked for another appointment, just the particular attentiveness of a space arranged around a single purpose. She had known this morning would require room. She had the trust documentation spread across the conference table when I came in the original filing, the beneficiary designation, the structural provisions Harold had built into the instrument over the course of several months. She had reviewed it again the previous evening, she said, and confirmed that the activation mechanism was exactly what she had described at our first meeting. A spoken phrase, delivered by the named beneficiary in the presence of the administering attorney, recorded and witnessed. "You found it," she said. "It was not a question." "Last night," I said, "in a card he wrote 40 years ago." She nodded once and did not ask me to explain further. She understood, I think, that some things do not need elaboration to be believed. She positioned the recording device on the table between us, a small, practical thing, nothing ceremonial about it, and opened the trust document to the activation page. She identified herself for the record, stated the date and time, confirmed my identity and my status as named beneficiary, and then looked at me across the table. "When you're ready," she said. I had said the phrase already, the previous night, alone in Harold's chair. I had said it quietly, the way you say something when you are learning its weight before you carry it in front of anyone else. But saying it here was different. This was the room Harold had prepared. Margaret was the witness he had chosen. The document on the table was the structure he had built over months of careful, private work while he was ill and while people around him were already planning for a future they intended to control. I looked at the recording device. Then I looked at the trust document. Then I said the words, "The court is yours, counselor." Margaret did not move immediately. She let the words stand in the room for a moment long enough to be real, not so long as to become something other than what they were. Then she reached forward and stopped the recording. "The trust is fully activated," she said. "The Grace Street building, all associated assets, and all provisions Harold established are now under your sole authority as beneficiary. No challenge filed through the current guardianship proceeding can reach this instrument. It is legally insulated from the competency hearing entirely." She slid the activation page across the table for my signature. I signed it with Harold's pen, which I had brought without planning to. We sat for a moment after that without speaking. Outside the window, Richmond was moving through a Tuesday morning the way cities do, indifferent to the things being resolved inside its buildings, which is not a failing but simply the nature of cities. "He did all of this," I said, not as a question. "He did," Margaret said. "Every provision, every structural choice. He came to this office 6 times over 4 months. He never once told me what had prompted it." She paused. I asked him, "The last time?" "He said he wasn't certain anything was wrong. He said he just wanted to be sure that if something was, you would have everything you needed before you knew you needed it." I did not say anything. There are things that cannot be answered, and this was one of them. Ryan arrived at 11:30. He had called ahead this time, a brief message left that morning saying he needed to come by, that it was important, that it was not about the building. I had told Margaret, and she had offered to stay. I had said yes. He looked different when he came through the door. The careful presentation of the previous visit, the deliberate casualness, the practiced concern was gone. What was left was simpler and harder to look at. He sat at the conference table without being asked to, folded his hands in front of him, and did not look at the documents still spread across the surface. "I didn't know everything," he said. "I want to start with that, because it's true, and because the rest of what I'm going to tell you is going to make it hard to believe." He told it without being prompted. Victor had approached him 8 months ago through a professional contact, someone Ryan trusted, which was how Victor operated. The initial proposal had been straightforward, a management restructuring that would benefit the building's long-term value. Ryan had believed it, or he had wanted to believe it, which he acknowledged was not the same thing. Then Victor had found something. A decision Ryan had made 3 years ago, a financial arrangement that Ryan had not disclosed to Harold, that he had believed was resolved. That was not. Victor had documentation. The terms became different after that. "He didn't ask me to do anything directly harmful," Ryan said. "The qualification landed without softening anything. He just needed access. He needed someone on the inside who wouldn't ask certain questions." He looked at the table. I told myself it was manageable, that I could find a way to limit it. "But you couldn't," I said. "No." The room was quiet for a moment. I had spent 19 days moving toward this conversation, and now that it was here, I found that I did not have the anger I had expected. What I had instead was something older and more tired, the particular weight of loving someone and understanding, fully and at last, the distance between who they are and who you needed them to be. "Ryan," I said, "did you know about Eleanor Sims?" Something shifted in his face. Not surprised he recognized the name. That alone told me something. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. Silence. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I had presided over for 30 years, which I had not expected. Richmond civil hearing rooms carry a different weight than the circuit courts I had known, less ceremony, more procedure, the architecture of a space designed for resolution rather than declaration. The gallery held perhaps 20 people. The bench was occupied by a judge I recognized by name but had never appeared before, a man in his early 60s with the particular economy of movement that comes from spending decades making decisions in rooms like this one. I sat at the respondents' table with Margaret on my left and did not look at the other side. Victor Hale arrived 4 minutes before the scheduled time, with Dennis Farrow beside him carrying a document case that held, I knew, the materials they intended to present as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. They sat without acknowledgement. Farrow arranged his papers. Victor adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and looked at the bench. He had not looked at me. The hearing opened with procedural statements, the petition filed by Victor Hale as a concerned party, the nature of the competency review being sought, the standard of evidence applicable under Virginia law. The presiding judge read each element with the neutral precision of someone who had opened several hundred hearings and understood that the opening was not where the substance lived. Victor's attorney Farrow presented first. He was composed and methodical, which I had expected. He laid out the documentation in sequence. A physician's letter of concern, signed by a name I did not recognize, a financial review prepared by a consultant whose credentials Farrow described at length, a log of what he called irregular decisions attributed to me over the preceding 8 months, including the refusal to engage with proposed management restructuring for the Grace Street property. Each item was presented as evidence of a pattern. Each item was framed as concern. He was good. I had known, from Eleanor's account and from what I had seen in the building footage, that Farrow understood how to build a case from materials that were individually ambiguous, but collectively persuasive. He had done exactly that. The judge reviewed each item as it was entered and asked 2 clarifying questions, both procedural. Then he looked to Margaret. Margaret stood. She did not begin with the footage. She began with the trust. She presented the irrevocable trust documentation, Harold's filing, the activation record from day 19, the full beneficiary designation and established, in 3 minutes of precise legal language, that the Grace Street building and all associated assets were fully protected under an instrument that had been in place for 8 months and that no competency proceeding could reach. The petition, she noted, was therefore moot with respect to the property it appeared primarily concerned with. Farrow objected. The judge noted the objection and asked Margaret to continue. She continued with the footage. Daniel's documentation chain of custody, archive installation records, timestamp verification came first, establishing the integrity of what followed. Then the footage itself. 3 meetings between the petitioner and Ryan Callahan inside a private commercial property, conducted without the owner's knowledge. Then the stairwell still frames, identifying Dennis Farrow as present during 2 of those meetings. Farrow objected again. The judge noted it again. Margaret presented the management agreement Ryan had brought to my kitchen table on day 4 unsigned with the specific transfer clauses highlighted and entered it as evidence of the intended outcome of those meetings. Then she said, "The respondent calls Ryan Callahan." The door at the back of the courtroom opened. Ryan walked in without looking at Farrow or at Victor. He had dressed carefully, not formally, but carefully, the distinction being that he had chosen clothes for a room where he intended to be believed, rather than to impress. He took the stand, was sworn, and folded his hands in his lap the way he had at Margaret's conference table 6 days earlier. Margaret asked him 3 questions. She asked whether he had met with Victor Hale at the Grace Street building without the owner's knowledge. He said yes. She asked whether Victor Hale had, at any point, used information against him to compel his cooperation. He said yes. She asked whether, to his knowledge, Victor Hale had previously conducted similar arrangements involving another property owner in Charlottesville. He said yes. 3 questions. 3 answers. Farrow's objections were noted and overruled on each. The judge called a brief recess. During the recess, I sat at the table and did not speak. Margaret reviewed her notes. From the corner of my eye, I could see Farrow speaking quietly to Victor near the far wall, the rapid, compressed conversation of attorneys recalibrating. When the session resumed, the judge declined to grant the petition. He cited the trust documentation, the footage evidence, and the testimony of the petitioner's own cooperating party as collectively insufficient to meet the standard required for a competency review. The petition was dismissed. The room redistributed itself, people standing, papers being gathered, the ordinary aftermath of a proceeding that had reached its conclusion. I stood. Margaret put her hand briefly on my arm. Victor was still at his table. Farrow was packing the document case, moving with the efficient neutrality of a professional absorbing a loss he had not anticipated but would process and continue from. Victor was not moving. He was looking at me not with the ease he had carried into the room, but with something stripped of that ease, something underneath it that was trying to find an explanation. He said one word. "How?" He said it quietly enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate distance between us. He was not asking Margaret. He was not asking the room. He was asking me, the woman he had assessed, categorized, and underestimated from the moment someone had described the Gray Street building to him as an anchor parcel waiting to be claimed. I looked at him for a moment. I did not answer. Some questions are asked because the person asking believes they deserve an answer, and some questions answer themselves if you give them enough room. I picked up my bag and walked out of the courtroom. He was still in the hallway when it happened. I had come through the courtroom doors, perhaps 2 minutes ahead of Victor and Pharaoh, long enough to reach the corridor and pause near the window at the far end, where the afternoon light came through at an angle that made the institutional space briefly resemble something else. Margaret was beside me, sliding documents back into her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who had already moved on to the next thing, while the current thing was still concluding. Then the hallway changed. Agent Doyle came from the left corridor with 2 colleagues, not hurried, not theatrical, moving with the particular economy of people who have prepared for exactly this and have no need to announce it. Victor came through the courtroom doors with Pharaoh at his side, mid-sentence, and stopped. Doyle identified herself and stated the basis for the action with the same focused precision she had brought to the conference room on day 18. The words were formal, procedural, the language of federal authority applied cleanly to a specific situation. Pharaoh stepped back. Victor did not move for a moment, the stillness of a man whose calculations have all reached their conclusions simultaneously and found none of them useful. Then, it was done. Pharaoh made 2 phone calls in the hallway afterward. I did not watch him make them. Margaret touched my arm once, briefly, and I understood it as what it was, not celebration, but acknowledgement. The kind that passes between people who have done difficult work together and understand that this is what completion feels like. Quiet, and slightly anticlimactic, and entirely real. We did not speak much on the walk to the car. I had one more stop to make. Sunrise Manor looked the same as it had on day 12, the oak trees, the low building, the parking area in the early afternoon emptier than it would be by evening. The front desk staff recognized me this time and directed me to the east wing without asking questions. Eleanor was in the common room again, in the same chair. She looked up when I came through the door, and something in her expression adjusted, not surprise, but the careful attention of someone who has learned not to assume good news before it is confirmed. I sat in the chair across from her. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a maintenance worker was moving slowly along the garden path, with a cart unhurried, the ordinary world proceeding in its ordinary way. "The hearing?" she asked. "Dismissed." The petition had no ground to stand on. I paused, and Victor was taken into custody in the hallway afterward. Federal charges. Agent Doyle's office handled it. Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap. She did not cry, which I had not expected her to. She was not, I had come to understand, a woman who expressed relief through visible emotion. What moved across her face was something quieter, the particular settling of a person who has been holding a weight for a long time and has finally been told they can set it down. "The Charlottesville case," she said. "Does this affect it?" Margaret believes it does. I had discussed this with Margaret in the car on the way over. The documentation on the drive, the evidence Harold assembled about the prior proceedings, gives grounds to reopen the matter. The conduct that closed it originally is now itself under federal review. I looked at her. "Margaret would like to take your case. No fee. She said it's the right thing to do with a case like this." Eleanor looked up. "She doesn't know me," she said. "She knows what happened to you," I said, "and she knows how it happened." That's enough for Margaret. Eleanor was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded once, the same decisive nod I had seen from Margaret, from Harold's notes, from women who have had to learn to receive help without diminishing themselves in the receiving of it. "Tell her yes," Eleanor said. We sat for another 20 minutes. We talked about smaller things, the oak trees outside, a book Eleanor had been reading, the particular quality of late afternoon light in the common room that she had come to appreciate. We did not talk about Victor again, or about the drive, or about the years between the Charlottesville case and this afternoon. Some things do not need to be revisited once they have been resolved. They need only to be acknowledged and set down in the right place. When I left, Eleanor walked me to the door of the East Wing further than she had come on my first visit. "Dorothy," she said at the threshold. I turned. "Harold was a good man," she said. "I never met him. But the kind of person who builds what he built for someone else, in advance, without knowing if it would ever be needed," she paused. "That's a particular kind of love. Not everyone knows how to do it." I thanked her and walked to the car. The drive back to Richmond took the usual time, and the neighborhood was quiet when I turned onto my street. I had been awake since before 6 that morning and had moved through more in a single day than most days contain. The house looked the same as it always did: the front walk, the porch, the particular way the late light fell across the upper windows. I checked the mailbox out of habit. There were 2 pieces of ordinary mail, and one envelope beneath them smaller than the others, ivory-colored, with no return address and no postage. A postal sticker had been placed across the front, "Return to sender undeliverable as addressed." The address on the envelope was not mine. I turned it over. No return address on the back either, only my address printed in handwriting I recognized before I had consciously registered that I was recognizing it. Harold's handwriting. I stood at the mailbox for a long moment, holding an envelope my husband had written and sent to somewhere I did not yet know, that had been returned to this house, on this day, in a year he had not lived to see. 3 months changed the quality of silence. In the first days after Harold passed, the quiet in this house had been acute, the kind that presses against the walls and makes every room feel like an interruption of something that should still be continuing. By day 17, when I had sat in his study looking for a phrase in a 40-year-old card, the silence had become textured, something I moved through rather than something that moved through me. Now, in the 3rd month of summer, it had settled into something I did not have a precise word for. Not absence, not presence, but the particular quality of a space that has been lived in long enough that the living never fully leaves it. I carried my coffee to the back garden at 7:30. Harold's chair, a low wooden thing he had refinished twice and refused to replace, positioned at the edge of the garden where the light came through the oak, at a useful angle for reading, was where I sat now on mornings when the weather allowed. I had not planned to make it a habit. It had become one regardless, which I had come to understand as its own kind of answer. The summer had moved through its months the way summers do when you are too occupied to track them carefully in arrivals rather than passages. The garden had done what gardens do without being asked. Victor Hale had been sentenced in federal court 8 weeks after the hearing. 7 years, with the judicial misconduct findings contributing significantly to the severity of the outcome. Dennis Farrow had entered into a cooperation agreement and surrendered his license to practice. The judge identified in Harold's documentation the man who had been sitting on a federal bench when I carried a small drive into a conference room on East Main Street, had resigned before charges were formally brought, was currently facing a separate proceeding. I had not followed it closely. Margaret kept me informed at the level I asked to be informed, which was enough to know the shape of things without living inside them. Eleanor's case had been reopened. Margaret had been thorough and patient, which was the only way Margaret knew how to be. The partial recovery from the original settlement had been reviewed in light of the new evidence, and a judgment had been entered that would allow Eleanor to leave Sunrise Manor within the year if she chose to. She had called to tell me herself, on a Tuesday morning, in the same careful voice she used for everything. Ryan was working through his own legal process, a separate matter, slower, with an outcome that was not yet determined. We had spoken twice. The conversations had been short and honest, which was more than I had expected and perhaps more than either of us had managed for some time before all of this began. I did not know what the next years would hold for him. I knew that the shape of what he chose now would determine most of it, and that this was as it should be. The envelope had sat on Harold's desk for 3 months. I had not been avoiding it exactly. I had been waiting for a morning when the weight of it felt like the right weight to carry, when I had enough around me to hold what was inside it, without it becoming something larger than it was. This morning, in the garden, with the coffee still warm and the light coming through the oak at its useful angle, felt like that morning. I opened it carefully, the way Harold opened things. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his stationery, the kind he had used for personal correspondence for as long as I could remember, cream-colored with his name printed at the top in small letters. The handwriting was from late in his illness, slower than his earlier hand but still deliberate, still choosing each word before committing it. He had written a date at the top 7 months before he passed. He had written my name below it, without the formal address he used for professional correspondence. Just Dorothy, the way he said it when it was only the 2 of us in a room. And then, in the measured lines of a man who had spent a career saying exactly what he meant, "I don't know when this will reach you, or what will have happened by the time it does. I sent it to the wrong address on purpose. I wanted it to find its way back when the time was right rather than arrive before you were ready for it. Everything I built because I knew you. The trust, the archive, the documentation, none of it was complicated. It was just careful. And I was careful because I knew what you were capable of, even when you were too close to it to see clearly. I built the walls. You were always the judge. The court was yours from the beginning. I just made sure the room was ready. I love you. That's the whole letter. Harold. I sat with it for a long time. The coffee went cold. The light shifted. The garden moved through its ordinary morning without asking anything of me, which was exactly what I needed it to do. Harold had not known what would happen. He had not known about Agent Doyle's file, or about Eleanor's reopened case, or about the morning I would stand in a hallway and watch the man who had called his building an anchor parcel discover what an anchor actually does when it holds. He had known only what he had always known, the things that do not change because circumstances change. That I was capable of more than the situation would have me believe, that preparation is its own form of love, and that the most important thing one person can do for another is to make sure the room is ready before the moment arrives. I built the walls. You were always the judge. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I kept it in my pocket for the rest of the day. If you've stayed with this story from the morning Ryan arrived with his folder and his careful concern, I want to ask you something before you go. Harold never told Dot what he was building. He never explained the trust, the archive, the documentation he was assembling. He made his preparations in private, and he left them in the right hands, and he trusted that the person he had spent 40 years building a life with would know what to do when the time came. Some people would say he should have told her, that she deserved to know what was coming, to have the chance to prepare alongside him rather than arriving at the evidence after the fact. Others would say that what he did was telling her in the only language that mattered, which was action rather than words. What do you think? Was Harold right to stay silent, or did Dot deserve to know earlier? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. And before you go, where are you watching from? Richmond has been with us for 17 chapters. Tell me where you've been reading this from. I'd like to know. If this story stayed with you, if Harold's letter, or Eleanor's nod, or the moment Dot said 6 words into a recording device and 40 years became a legal instrument, if any of it mattered to you, the best thing you can do is subscribe. These stories take time to build. Your support is what makes them possible. The court, as Harold would say, is yours.